Hi, I'm Olivia from Classroom 42, and today we're doing a full exam walkthrough for Edexcel GCSE History Paper 3. In this video, we'll be doing an exam overview, a walkthrough of each question type, some exam questions for you to try, and some grade 9 example answers. So for Paper 3, this will be your last GCSE History paper, and this will focus on your modern depth study topics. So this will either be Russia and the Soviet Union, Weimar and Nazi Germany, Mao's China, or USA conflict at home and abroad. This paper is a written exam. It is 1 hour and 30 minutes and is worth 52 marks, and this paper will make up 30% of your History GCSE. So let's have a look at the question types for this paper. So you've got quite a few different question types here, and we also look at sources and interpretations within this paper. So your question 1 is 2 things you can infer about source A, and that's 4 marks. Your question 2A/B, because for this one you get to choose which question you answer, and this is an explain why question that's worth 12 marks. Your question 3A is how useful are sources B and C, and that's worth 8 marks. Your question 3B is differences in interpretations, and that's worth 4 marks. 3C is reasons for differences in interpretations, and that's also worth 4 marks. And then 3D is how far do you agree with the interpretation, and that one is your 16 marker with 4 marks for SPAG as well. Okay, so let's have a look at the first question. So this first question will look at a standalone source, so this source won't be in any of your other questions in the paper. And this question asks you to give 2 things you can infer about the source. It's only worth 4 marks, so you only need to kind of do 1 paragraph for this question. And to achieve full marks, you need to make 1 valid inference, which will give you 1 mark, and then give a supporting detail from the source about that inference, and then do that again. So let's take a look at an example question for this one. So our question is, give 2 things you can infer from source A about the Night of the Long Knives. So it will always give us our topic that we're looking at here. You can see here that this is our source. Feel free to pause the video if you want to take a bit of a closer look at it, but source A is an article about the Night of the Long Knives published by Times Magazine on the 9th of July 1934, and it just describes what happened, some of what happened during the Night of the Long Knives, so talking about how Hitler accused the stormtroop leaders of treacherously plotting a coup against him, and how about Goering's proofs as well. Okay, so let's look at an example answer for this question. So in your paper, you will be given the 4 sections, and you just need to write your bit of information or your detail in the source under each section. So it's nice and simple. You don't need to write like a full paragraph for this one. You just need to write a sentence for each kind of subheading. So you can see here for our first subheading, we've got what can I infer? So we've made our first inference here that Hitler was very paranoid while he was in power. Then we need to include a detail from the source that tells me this. So it's always kind of easiest to just include a quote that directly shows that inference. So we've included our detail from the source there. And then we've just done the same again. So we've got our second inference, which is Goering intensified Hitler's paranoia about the threat of the SA. And then we've given our second detail from the source, which is another quote. And that is how to get 4 out of 4 marks on that first question. Okay, so for the next question, so this is question 2A/B, because you do get a choice between 2 questions for this one. As always, don't spend too long sort of deciding which question you're going to do. Just have a quick skim of each one and then choose the topic that you feel most confident on. So this one is an explain why question that's worth 12 marks. We've seen this one quite a few times come up in other papers, so you should be nice and confident on this one by now. And for this one, we do get our 2 stimulus points as well. So those are 2 points that we can talk about within our answer if we want to. We don't have to use them if we don't want to. But if you do use those 2 stimulus points, you need to make sure that you also include a point of your own, at least one, to make sure that your marks aren't capped at 8 marks. So this question asks us to explain why a particular event or change occurred. It calls for 3 peel paragraphs. For example, you could do 1 on each of the stimulus points and 1 on your own idea, or you can do them all on your own ideas if you want to. So for our peel paragraphs, as always, obviously this is point, evidence, explain, and link. So we're giving our point, so 1 reason for this particular change is, and then we're stating our point. Our evidence, so we're bringing in precise and relevant historical evidence, so our stats, places, names, dates, all that kind of stuff. Then we're going to use our evidence to explain why this factor led to change. Obviously, this is really important in this question because the whole question is explain why. So we've really got to make sure that we include that explanation and we're not just sort of stating facts. And then finally, we are linking back to the question at the end of each paragraph to reinforce why our point led to change. So let's have a look at an example question. So our question is, explain why the Nazi Party introduced new policies towards women in the years 1933 to 39. You may use the following in your answer, and we've got family and employment. So those are our two stimulus points that I mentioned. So we can already see that we've got our sort of topic here, which is women, and the question. We've always got to make sure that we are reading the question. So it's very easy to sort of just see the word women and just sort of kind of answer the questions to what we think it's going to be, but we've got to make sure that we read the questions. This is asking us why the Nazi Party introduced the new policies towards women. So what was the reason behind them introducing these new policies? So you can see in my answer, I've not got an intro or conclusion. We don't really need one for the 12 marker. We can just go straight into our paragraphs. And here I've got a paragraph on family, a paragraph on employment, and then my final paragraph is on traditional appearances. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is bring in our point. So you can see here that we've got our point that is about family. Then we are bringing in our evidence. So we've talked about the law of encouragement of marriage. We've talked how this gives couples a loan of 1,000 marks and allowing them to keep 250 for each child that they had. And we've also mentioned the Mother's Cross as well. So we've got lots of our own historical knowledge in there. Then we are explaining why. So we're explaining why the Nazi Party introduced this new policy. So these rewards encouraged women to have more children and focus on motherhood, which helped boost the birth rate and fit Hitler's vision of a growing, racially pure nation. So that's explaining why the Nazi Party introduced that policy. And then finally, we are linking back to the question, just kind of reiterating our point. So therefore, the Nazi policies towards women focused on encouraging childbirth to help build a stronger Aryan population for the future of Germany. So that's our first point. Our second point is talking about employment. So again, here we are bringing our evidence. So we are talking about how they introduced the law of reduction of unemployment, which gave women financial incentives to give up work. Women were not conscripted into work until 1943, and women were also not included in the Nazis' unemployment figure as well. Then we're going to explain why the Nazi Party introduced this policy. So this meant that the Nazis were able to claim full employment by 1939, and women could focus on having large families and stay in the traditional role as a mother. And then we're just linking back to the question once again. Therefore, they introduced new policies towards women to reduce unemployment among men and reinforce traditional gender roles. And then finally, we're giving our last point, which is about reinforcing traditional appearances. We're going to bring in our evidence. So we're talking about how in the Weimar years, women experimented with their appearances, wore shorter dresses and more makeup. However, the Nazi Party encouraged traditional German fashions to enforce the Aryan race and traditional role of women. Makeup, dyed hair, or wearing trousers was frowned upon. Then we're going to explain, so this further enforced the control that the Nazi Party had over women and kept traditional German appearances in force. Therefore, the Nazi Party introduced new policies towards women in order to reinforce traditional roles and reduce individuality within Germany. So there are our 3 points, and that is going to give us 12 out of 12 marks. Okay, so for our next questions, this is question 3A, we are looking at two sources. So this is the same as your source question back on paper 1. So we're comparing two sources, one text and one image source. So for this question, you should write 2 paragraphs. Your first paragraph should assess the usefulness of source B, and your second paragraph should assess the usefulness of source C. So the question will ask us how useful are the sources in sort of an inquiry into a particular topic, so we need to focus on that topic within our paragraphs. For this question, you don't need to sort of interlink or cross-reference the 2 sources. You can keep your paragraphs very separate. We're just sort of looking at the usefulness of one and you're looking at the usefulness of the other. So you could structure each paragraph as follows. So first of all, we want to include content. So what information does the source give you that is relevant to the inquiry topic? So this might be quotes for the text source. It might be describing what's going on in the image source. Then we're going to bring in our historical knowledge. So a really great way to bring in our historical knowledge is to talk about the accuracy of the sources. So for example, we could explain kind of what the content of the source is. And then we're going to say, I know that this is true because bring in our historical knowledge, or this does not align with my historical knowledge of, and bring in our historical knowledge. So it's a great way to sort of use our own knowledge in a bit more of a natural way, while also sort of talking about the usefulness and accuracy of the source. Then we're going to bring in our provenance. So this is the bit of text at the top of the source that tells us a little bit about the author, maybe a bit about their beliefs, about what the source actually is. So whether it's, you know, a newspaper article, a propaganda poster, that kind of thing. And we can talk about how this affects the source's usefulness and also its accuracy. So we've got to think about the author's background, beliefs and experiences. We're going to look at the context of when and where they're writing and the information available to them. And we're going to look at the purpose and intended audience. So these are all things that might affect the accuracy of the source. So for example, if the purpose of the source is to persuade or to entertain, it might mean that, you know, the accuracy of the source might be different. And also the author's background, beliefs and experiences are also very key in sort of influencing the author and what they might think, and whether the source is actually accurate. A really important thing to remember in this question is that accuracy does not equal usefulness. So a source, for example, if our source was a speech from Hitler, we know that Hitler is obviously trying to push the Nazi ideals. He's going to be using it as propaganda. He's trying to brainwash the citizens of Germany. So it's not necessarily going to be an accurate source for a historian. However, it does not mean that it's not useful. This source, although we know it probably isn't telling the truth of what actually is going on, we know that it is still useful for historians because it allows us to sort of get a bit more insight into what the German people were taking in. It gives us an insight into perhaps what Hitler was trying to push in the Nazi regime. So even though a source is not accurate, it often is still useful for historians. And then finally, we need to make our judgment on whether the source is useful or not. So yeah, as I said, even if you are talking about the provenance and talking about how this reduces the source's accuracy, you may still come to the conclusion that the source is useful for a historian because it gives sort of the other side of the story, it gives sort of ideas about what the government were trying to push, that kind of thing. So for this section, we need to make a clear overall judgment on the usefulness of the source for the inquiry. So let's have a look at an example question for this one. So our question is how useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into the experiences of young people living in Nazi Germany. So you can see this is our sort of theme or topic is young people living in Nazi Germany, and we've got our sources here. As always, it's giving us a little bit more in the question here, so we're going to explain our answer using sources B and C and your knowledge of the historical context. So that shows that we need to, as well as including content from sources B and C, we also need to bring in our own historical knowledge. So here are our two sources. As always, feel free to pause the video if you want to get a bit of a closer look at them. But we've got source B, which is a poster by Ludwig Holbein, who was a strong supporter of Hitler. And the text reads, "The German student fights for the Führer and the people." And you can see here we've got a picture of a, sort of classic Aryan boy here in his uniform. He's holding a Nazi flag, pretty classic sort of Nazi propaganda poster there. Then we've got our source C. So this one is from an autobiography of McKee, who was a member of the German League of Girls. And this sort of just outlines how from a very early age they were taught to prepare for motherhood. It was their duty to breed and rear the new generation, and how this led to a few illegitimate small sons and daughters for the Reich brought by teenage members of the League of German Maidens. So let's have a look at an example answer for this question. So you can see here we've just got our two paragraphs. You don't need an introduction or conclusion for this one, as long as you make sure that you've got your final sort of sentence is giving a bit of a summary of the usefulness of each source. So first of all, we are talking about source B. So we are giving our content of the source first of all, as you can see here. So we are talking about how it depicts an Aryan boy with blonde hair holding the Nazi flag, talking about the text that it reads, suggesting how the experiences of young boys in Nazi Germany was extremely positive. Then we're going to talk about the provenance. So you don't have to do these paragraphs in any particular order. You can sort of, as long as you make sure that you've got content, provenance, own knowledge, and sort of a summary of the utility, you can sort of create your paragraphs in whatever sort of order that feels most natural. So yeah, now I'm coming on to the provenance. So we're talking about how the artist was an avid supporter of Hitler. Therefore, this is a propaganda poster aimed to indoctrinate young boys and encourage them to join the Hitler Youth. Then we're going to bring in our historical knowledge. So then we're talking about Hitler Youth. So we're talking about how it was a youth group, how membership was compulsory by 1936, and what sort of the Hitler Youth included. And then we are going to look at the usefulness. So I've said, therefore, source B is not an accurate depiction of the experiences of all young people in Nazi Germany. However, I would argue that this does not diminish its utility. Many boys living in Nazi Germany would have had an experience similar to the boys shown in the poster, as they were so indoctrinated they may have enjoyed their time in Hitler Youth and felt proud to be the future of the Nazi Party. So talking about how perhaps it is useful. Therefore, although source B is not an entirely accurate depiction of the experiences of young people in Nazi Germany, it is still useful for the inquiry. So as you can see, as I mentioned, we're saying that it's a propaganda poster. It's obviously not going to be an accurate reflection of the experiences of all young people. However, it still is useful because it might be true for certain people who were quite indoctrinated within the regime. And then on our second paragraph, so this is where we're focusing on source C. So you can see here I'm starting with provenance this time. So I'm talking about how it's an extract from an autobiography, who was in the German League of Girls, so experienced the regime firsthand. Then I'm giving a bit of the content of the source, so talking about what the author says. Bringing in my own historical knowledge, so talking about the League of German Maidens, how it was compulsory. It was a youth group where they were prepared for motherhood and indoctrinated with Nazi ideology, and talking about the Lebensborn as well, which was set up in 1935. And then we're going to talk about the usefulness. So we're saying, therefore, source C is extremely useful for the inquiry because many of the author's experiences can be backed up with historical context. Although the accuracy of the source may be decreased because it was written for an autobiography, so the author may have exaggerated her experiences to make the book more entertaining. However, overall I argue that source C is very useful for the inquiry as the author had experience of Nazi Germany as a young person herself. So again, we've said, although the provenance of the source may reduce the accuracy of the source, it doesn't mean that it's not useful. And that is our question 3A. Okay, so for our next question, which is question 3B, we are looking at our interpretations. So within this paper, you get your standalone source for question 1, you get your 2 sources for question 3, and within question 3, you always also get your 2 interpretations. So your sources will always be something from someone who has perhaps experienced the event themselves, or it was published near to when the event actually happened. It's often more of a first-hand account or a bit more of a recent account, whereas our interpretations are often written by historians or people quite after the event or after the time who are giving sort of more secondary sort of opinions on what happened. So for this question, we are asked what are the differences within the interpretations, and this one is worth 4 marks. So we need to identify a difference between the interpretation's views on a particular topic. Now these interpretations will focus on the same topic as your sources B and C look at, so we're going to be basically looking at that topic for the next few questions or within question 3. And again, this question's only worth 4 marks, so you just need one clear and concise paragraph. So to structure your answer, you could do the following. So you can state your argument, so the main difference between interpretation 1 and interpretation 2 is, and state your point. Then you're going to want to explain interpretation 1, so identify the interpretation's view on the topic and explain how you know this using details from the source. And then you're going to do the same for interpretation 2, so you're going to identify their view on the topic and highlight how this differs from interpretation 1 and explain how you know this. Okay, so here is our question. So we've got study interpretations 1 and 2. They give different views about the experiences of young people living in Nazi Germany. So you can see we're still looking at young people in Nazi Germany. What is the main difference between these 2 views? Explain your answer using details from both interpretations. So we need to make sure that we talk about both of the interpretations in this question. As always, feel free to pause it if you want to have a bit of a closer look at these interpretations. But interpretation 1 is from Katrine Clay, who published a book in 2010 about Trautmann's journey. Now this talks about Bert Trautmann and how when he was in Hitler Youth, he really sort of enjoyed the Nazi propaganda, and he would, enjoy giving the salute and speaking the oath and that kind of thing. Whereas our interpretation 2, which is written by Kate Haste, published in 2001, she talks about the German girls' duty to be healthy and how they must sort of be childbearers, how they did lots of sport and sort of domestic skills, which took precedence over intellectual pursuits, and how all girls were trained in household subjects and theory of nutrition and baby care, things like that. So those are our sources. So let's have a look at our example answer for this question. So you can see here I've split it into 2 paragraphs, but you can just keep it as 1 full paragraph as well if you want to. It's just a bit easier to show it when it's in 2. So first of all, we have given our argument. So the main difference between the interpretations is they show positive and negative experiences of young people in Nazi Germany. We are going to identify our detail from interpretation 1. So we're talking about how young people were enthusiastic and they couldn't wait to join Hitler Youth. So here I've used a quote. You can just use paraphrasing if you'd prefer to as well. And then we're going to explain this detail. So a good way to sort of make sure that you do explain it is by starting with this suggests that. So here we're saying this suggests that young people had a positive experience in Nazi Germany and the Hitler Youth group was a fun and exciting activity for young boys. Then we're going to do the same for interpretation 2. So in contrast, interpretation 2 gives the view that young girls were forced to follow traditional roles and girls were told that intellectual pursuits were against their nature. Again, adding in a quote there. And then we're just explaining it. So this suggests that young girls did not have a positive experience in Nazi Germany as they were forced to prepare for childbearing and had fewer opportunities than boys did. And that is question 3b. Okay, and now question 3c. So we're still looking at our 2 interpretations, but we are looking at reasons for differences in the interpretation. So our first question, question 3b, was asking us what the differences are. Now we're asking why they're different. So this question is worth 4 marks, so you need, again, 1 clear and concise paragraph, and you should clearly state your chosen reason, explain using an analysis of interpretation 1, and explain using an analysis of interpretation 2. So you need to consider how the historians came to their respective judgments. So there are a few different reasons as to why interpretations might differ, so I've given you a few examples here. So first of all, historians might have used different sources to inform their judgments, and you can reference the sources in your exam paper if they're relevant. So your sources B and C will most likely sort of coincide with your 2 interpretations. So you can say, for example, interpretation 1 would have used sources such as source C, so therefore that's why they would have had that sort of that judgment, whereas your other interpretation used sources like the other source. Another reason might be that historians have chosen to place different emphasis on different factors. And finally, historians might have had different perspectives, approaches, and focuses. So let's take a look at our question. So here we have got suggest 1 reason why interpretations 1 and 2 give different views about the experiences of young people living in Nazi Germany. You may use sources B and C to help explain your answer. And here is our example answer. So you can see, again, I've just done a 1 paragraph here. First of all, we are identifying our reason for differences. So in this one, I have said that the interpretation is different because they put different weight to different sources. Here I'm looking at our sources. For example, and then we're going to analyse interpretation 1. Source B, which depicts the experiences of the youth to be positive and shows Hitler Youth member looking proud, provides some in support for interpretation 1, which states that young people enjoyed living in Nazi Germany and felt proud to be part of groups such as Hitler Youth. And then we're going to do the same for interpretation 2, whereas source C, which shows an evidence that many young girls were pressured into having children at a young age by the Nazis, provides some support for interpretation 1, which emphasises the fact that young girls had a duty to be good mothers and intellectual opportunities were taken away from them. So you can see there we've analysed interpretation 1 and analysed interpretation 2. Okay, and for our final question, question 3D, this is our how far do you agree question with the interpretations. This one is worth 16 marks and you also do get 4 spag marks, so it's really important that after you finished your answer, read through it and just double check your spelling, punctuation and grammar. So this is slightly along the same vein as our how far do you agree questions from other papers. However, instead of sort of getting given a statement and stimulus points, we're looking at the interpretation. So it'll ask us how far do we agree with one of the interpretations. There's not really any set way to answer this question. However, you're required to use both of the interpretations and your knowledge of historical context. So for example, you could structure it as follows. So the way I would recommend is doing 2 Peel paragraphs and your conclusion. But these Peel paragraphs need to sort of be a bit more in depth compared to our Peel paragraphs, say for the 12 marker. So our first paragraph might be arguments in support of interpretation 1. So we're going to give our point, so stating the view of interpretation 1 about the specific topic in the question. Then we're going to give our evidence, so identifying specific details in the interpretation that convey this view, using quotes, paraphrasing, that kind of thing from the interpretation. Then we're going to explain, so we're going to explain how these details are supported and or contradicted by your historical knowledge. So there we're bringing in all of our historical knowledge. Going to link, so linking back to the question, based on your analysis, how far would you agree with the interpretation? And then you just do the exact same for interpretation 2. And then we're going to do our conclusion, which is going to be briefly summing up our judgment. So we're going to say how far we agree with the stated interpretation and why or why not. So in the question, it will ask us, for example, how far do you agree with interpretation 1? However, we do still need to really make sure that we do a judgment about both interpretations, and then our conclusion can just be kind of focusing on why we agree or disagree with interpretation 1, and then you might also include interpretation 2 within the conclusion as well. For example, you might say, I don't agree with interpretation 1 because interpretations like interpretation 2 are better for the inquiry. Okay, so let's have a look at our example answer for this question. So our question is, how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about the experiences of young people living in Nazi Germany? So we're still using our interpretations 1 and 2 that we were looking at in the previous 2 questions. Explain your answer using both interpretations. So you can see there, even though it's only mentioned interpretation 2, we need to include both interpretations in our answer. And we also need to include our knowledge of the historical context. So you can see here, this is my answer. So I've done my 2 Peel paragraphs. As you can see, these are a bit longer than our normal Peel paragraphs because we're obviously also talking about the interpretations, and we've got our conclusion as well. I wouldn't really suggest doing an introduction for this question. You can just go straight into your first paragraph, but I would really recommend doing a conclusion because this is a judgment question. We want to really make sure that the examiner knows that we've come to a judgment and that we have an opinion. So it's really great to just use your conclusion to just kind of reiterate your judgment. So first of all, I am looking at interpretation 1. And first of all, I'm giving my point. So I somewhat agree with interpretation 1 about the experiences of people in Nazi Germany, as it focuses on positive experiences of some boys in the Hitler Youth. Then we are giving our evidence. So this is our evidence from the interpretation, things like quotes, paraphrasing, explaining kind of what's going on. So I'm talking about how interpretation 1 highlights that the Hitler Youth appealed to boys like Bert Trautmann, who felt proud to be in the group, talking about his mother's concerns, and how boys in the Hitler Youth were encouraged to pledge absolute loyalty to Hitler, as shown in the oath, where he vows to devote all my powers and my strength to the saviour of our Reich. Then we're going to explain. So we are explaining this using our historical evidence and our historical knowledge. So we're talking about this aligns with the Nazi focus on militaristic and ideological training, which prepares boys to serve in the military, talking about Hitler Youth and what that included, and giving our sort of own knowledge on that. Then we are linking back to the question. So therefore, interpretation 1 is accurate to an extent because it shows how the Nazis created an appealing and structured environment for boys. And then I'm giving a bit of judgment. So at the start, I only said I somewhat agree with it. So although it does not reflect the experiences of all young people, as there were many groups of young people that resisted the Nazi Party, such as the Edelweiss Pirates, and many girls had a much harder experience as shown in interpretation 2. And then I am kind of coming on to interpretation 2 and how I agree with that one more. So we're adding in our point. So therefore I agree more with interpretation 2 because it shows contrasting and more restricted experiences of girls under the Nazi regime. We're giving our evidence from the source. So we're talking about how interpretation 2 focuses on the experiences of girls, showing how they prepared for motherhood, about the curriculum of that. Unlike boys whose training was more military focused, they were encouraged to prioritise physical health and domestic skills. Then we are explaining this and using our historical knowledge. So girls participated in physical exercises, class lessons on eugenics, to ensure that they were ready for childbearing. The interpretation reveals highly gendered expectations placed on girls who were given far less freedom and fewer opportunities. Unlike the excitement and adventure promoted to boys, girls' roles were limited to preparing for a future based solely on family and childbirth. This shows how the regime used youth organisations not only to indoctrinate but to enforce strict gender roles. And then I'm linking back to the question. Therefore, I strongly agree with interpretation 2 because it better reflects the full picture of how the Nazis controlled young people's lives in different and unequal ways. And then we're going to round up our answer by giving our conclusion. So this conclusion, we need to really focus on the question about how far we agree with the interpretations. In conclusion, while both interpretations highlight how Nazis controlled the youth, interpretation 2 provides a more complete view showing how gender shaped experiences. Therefore, I strongly agree with interpretation 2, as it helps to explain how the regime used youth organisation to build a future population that conformed to Nazi beliefs about both loyalty and gender roles. So you can see there we're just really making sure that we are explaining everything, we're giving our historical knowledge, but we are also focusing on the question about how far we agree with the interpretations. Okay, and that is question 3D. So now it is your turn. So I will link some of our 16 mark questions below, so feel free to have a go at those, and you'll get instant AI marks and feedback for those questions so you can see kind of where you've gone right and wrong. But yeah, good luck with your revision and best of luck in your history GCSE exams. Bye!